Ready to go, okay.
Okay, my name is Don Hubert. I finished high school in June of '44, and I was playing ball. I was looking for a job, and I heard they were going to hire on brakemen on the New York Central. Well, and over there, the New York Central, and they had finished hiring. So I was playing baseball, and I knew Leroy Binns, and he'd just hired on the C&O. So I went out to the C&O, which was the Pere Marquette at this time. So I got hired onto the Pere Marquette in July 20th was when my seniority date started, and it was a steam engine days then.
And what job were you doing? You were brakeman?
I was just taking a job as a brakeman.
And brakeman was a very dangerous job, wasn't it?
Well,
tell us a bit about what the brakeman...
You had to you had to have your wits about you and keep a safe distance from moving trains and boxcars and tanks cars. Of course, you made your review trips. I left St. Thomas at midnight on, it didn't matter, I guess what date, and I went to Windsor. From Windsor, I went downtown, got a border crossing card, and caught the Walkerville local from Walkerville to Chatham. And I spent the night in Chatham at a boarding house. And the next day, I caught a local for my review trips to go to Sarnia. I went into Sarnia in the afternoon and come out of there at night, and ended up in Blenheim, and I waited for a freight train to come to the water plug in the morning, and I got a freight train on the water plug from there to St. Thomas. And from then I finished my medical and my rule class.
And how long did that training take?
Oh, that took me a day and a half. I left one day, and then I didn't get home until the following day.
And what were your usual runs in those early days? Would that be your usual
trip
away? Yeah.
Yeah, that was just what would you call your review trips? You were learning the road.
And then so you became a brakeman in '44,
Yeah.
and what was your? I know that the schedule was pretty erratic, but what were your runs that you were doing, and
Well,
also what were you following on the train?
you worked on the spare board, and somebody laid off or an extra job come up, or you were called to go. The first two trips I made to Windsor and back, and the next week I worked a local from Sarnia to Blenheim and back, and I was up there for a week. When I come home there, I had to make my review trips on the East End, on New York Central. So I made my review trips on New York Central, on the local from St. Thomas to Niagara Falls and back. And then I took a freight train from St. Thomas to Buffalo and back on the C&O. Then I was qualified on all the East and the West End.
And explain a bit, because a lot of people aren't going to know, what does a brakeman do on the train?
Well, the brakeman looks at when you're on the tail end, what you call the caboose, or the head end. On the head end, you went to the service track after you booked in St. Thomas and checked in. You went to the service track and got the engine and picked up. At that time, you handled your own caboose from there to Talbot Yard and put it on the train, and then the brakeman would throw switches and put the engine on the head end of the cars, or the head end of the train. And after the setup, you get permission to go, and you on every station you look back on your train, on the east side and on the south side and the north side, to make sure there was no smoke or anything flying. Just check the train on curves and So the engineer was there where he usually moved up and let you look out the window rather than going out to the door and looking out the doorway.
And what were you hauling on these trains?
Pardon?
What were being carried on the C&O line in the Pere Marquette, in your first trains? You know, what were freight trains? But what were some of the freight that was being hauled?
Well, a lot of freight was mixed freights. In those days, it was the war was on, the Second World War. And a lot of the times you were hauling maybe a straight oil train or a coal train or mixed freight. And I guess we handled a lot of cars that had explosives in them, because they wouldn't come through New York Central Tunnel. They didn't take a chance on the tunnel, so everything we handled was by ferry across from Detroit to Windsor and into the CPR yard. So it was mixed freight most of the time. And then, of course, you might handle tank or flat cars with tanks or army equipment on them too. And in such case like that, why there was usually somebody from the military that rode the caboose, just to keep an eye on all things.
And so you rode in caboose?
Yeah, usually on our road, you rode the caboose one way from, say, if I rode the caboose from St. Thomas to Buffalo, on the return trip I'd ride the head end back to St. Thomas, where I think on New York Central you earned it by seniority. You earned a head end job or you earned a caboose job.
And I've heard that some of the guys, on layovers, they would stay in the caboose. They would stay in the caboose, live in the caboose.
Yeah. You stayed in the caboose when you got to the other end of the road. I forget that, I don't know just what year you eventually went to a hotel after that.
But tell me a bit about living in the caboose. Like, what was the setup like?
Usually the brakeman's job, you were at the other end of the caboose from where the stove was. In the wintertime, well, lots of times you'd wake up and there'd be snow right beside you, come in through the window, there's snow on the floor or blow under the door. So you get up in the morning after the call boy had come and knocked on the caboose door. You're called for 4 o'clock in the morning. We'd get up and stir the fire up and have a wash and cook up some bacon and eggs and have a pot of coffee or a pot of tea. And then the head end brakeman would go to the service track to get the engine out, where the tail end brakeman, he would walk the train and make sure all the brakes were off it. Where the conductor, he'd be going to the office and getting the bills and the way bills for the trains. On our railroad, if you were a head end brakeman, you were coming out of Buffalo, why you would ride the tail end from there to Niagara Falls, chance to get some lunch before you took the head end. Then you'd take the head end from Niagara Falls back to St. Thomas.
And did you stay a brakeman? Did you have any other jobs on the railway?
No, that's all I ever did was, I was laid off I hired in 44 and I laid off in 45 after the war. Business cut down, you weren't handling the military equipment and so forth, what you were during the war. And then some of the fellows that had seniority, brakemen and so forth, come back from the war, well, they took over some of my jobs. So I didn't get back on regular until late 40s, I guess. Just 49 or 50, and then from then on I worked regular.
I was curious when you talked about playing baseball. Where were you playing baseball?
Oh, right down the street here at the Ball Diamond on Wellington Street. Or at the YMCA at Ball Diamond.
Yes, before, when there was, when the park was still here.
Yeah.
So I've never actually known what the name of that park was. I mean, I've always had to describe the one, but this is when the Y was already built. So did they call it the YMCA?
Yeah.
Diamond? Okay.
Yeah, it was right at the subway and
Yeah, right beside where the car dealership ended
Yeah,
up being.
yeah.
I've seen pictures of it, but and I think there may have been a Ball Diamond even before the Y was built there in the corner, but I'm not sure about that.
Mhm.
So tell us some of did you have any other family members? What inspired you to go talk to the railway as soon as you?
Well, my father worked on the CN. He was a machinist with the CN railroad. My sister, she had worked for the Bell Telephone. My younger brother, why he did hire on the railroad later in years, but he didn't stay with the railroad. He went into the clothing business.
And where did you grow up in St. Thomas?
St. Thomas, I lived out on Brock Street, just out by the Waterworks Park.
That's out in the CN area.
Yeah.
Definitely. Tell us some of your other, memories,
In those
or
days,
if you had any memorable
in the wintertime, well,
trips,
Buffalo
anything
always
good or
got a
bad.
lot of snow. And they had what you call a 16-hour law. After 16 hours on the job, you didn't work anymore. You just stayed there until you relieved. Later on the years, it went to 14 hours, and after that, it went to 12 hours. But that was only in the United States. Lots of times, it didn't happen very often, but they tried to get you back in Canada, and then you could work the rest of whether you were over 16 hours or over your 14 hours or whatever.
And so there were different labor laws on each
Yeah.
side of the border.
Mhm.
Okay. When you started, what was, in 44, what was the normal working schedule?
Well,
How long would you work on those?
well, usually in the good weather, you were only 8 or 9 hours on the job. If you worked a yard job in St. Thomas, well, you were just usually 8 hours, or the odd time you might get a little bit of overtime.
But you never knew how long the trains were
No.
going to take in the winter
You
time.
just,
particularly.
in the yard job, boy, you worked until all the trains were switched and got out of town.
Did you ever work over at Talbot Yard ever? Do anything?
Yeah,
Yeah?
worked the top of the yard, and I worked 4 to midnight, and for a long time I worked in Sarnia Yard and 4 to midnight for the Dow Company. We were switching Dow for a full year in Sarnia, and then eventually got back into St. Thomas with a little more seniority, or more people retired. And
Can you explain a bit more about switching and assembling, like a marshalling yard, or explain how that works?
Well,
Lots of people who won't know.
in St. Thomas, or the eastbound and come in, lots of times when I first started, they were assembled in Windsor Yard, and so your tail end cars had Erie cars, and then you had your bridge cars, which Lehigh Valley and in Mount Rose we set off, and our New York Central cars that we set off at Mount Rose. So was which at Niagara Falls was what we called our Mount Rose Yard.
Okay.
And when you had eastbound out of here on your road to Head End, you set off your Lehigh Valleys and New York Centrals. You went back on the train, and then you went into the Erie Yard. And you might have to wait for a train in the Erie Yard. Sometimes, if you're on duty, that they had a long time, but I'm kind of stumbling here.
It's okay. I'm going to edit all of this magically.
Okay.
So anytime you say, "Oh, I will need a minute," or you stumble or something,
Yeah.
just start again, and I'll decide. I'll pick out the one that is
Okay,
the right
yeah.
one. I'm pretty sure. So don't worry about that at all.
But sometimes they had what you call an Erie flagman. If you had so many cars, and the westbound would drop the Erie flagman off, and he would be waiting there for the eastbound to take you back into Niagara Falls. So in that case, the two brakemen on the C&O train or the Pere Marquette train with the conductor rode the tail end from Niagara Falls, New York, into Buffalo, and the Erie flagman rode the head end and did the work there. So if we come out of the Erie yard in Buffalo, we come to Niagara Falls. Then we come to Mount Rose Yard, where we would make a pickup at the west end of Mount Rose Yard. We'd pick up any cars that come off the New York Central or the Erie Acalana, or any Erie locals which might have come out of Sarnia. And return empty cars would be going back to Sarnia, or that would be the Erie locals.
And so when you're running eastbound from St. Thomas, this is for local interest, I think, out of the Pere Marquette yard, the locomotive would go over to Talbot Yard, pick it up, and then come back through the yard?
Yeah, you
Okay.
come back, we come up the LMPS tracks in the New York Central Yard and over the eastbound through the New York Central Yard here and go eastbound to Niagara Falls or Fort Erie later on. We went through Fort Erie sometimes if we had a straight Buffalo train.
So was it easier to do the westbound on your own tracks or the eastbound on the Michigan Central tracks? Was there any difficulties using the
No.
Michigan Central? No? Okay.
Yeah.
All the communications were fine, and that although I've got more than a couple of pictures of derailments up at that curve up at Moore Street. That seemed to be,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
that seemed to cause some trouble sometimes for you
Yeah.
guys. But all right, well that's and how. So you would actually go across the border. You weren't just going into the road yard. You were actually
Yeah, we went across the border.
Explain a bit about going across the suspension or the international bridges.
Well, the international bridges, once in a while, you didn't very often see immigration. Once in a while they were there, but usually it was just custom offers. You dropped the customs papers off if you were the head end brakeman. You dropped the custom papers off and he'd check the train when you went by. But as I said, you didn't very often see immigration. I have had immigration. I've been the head end brakeman in immigration there, and he wanted to know my name and age, and the conductor's name and age. And I didn't know that. If I'd known this ahead of time, I would have had this information for you, but I can check with the fireman and the engineer, but the tail end brakeman and the conductor, I'm not sure of their ages and so forth.
So the head end brakeman was responsible for paperwork?
Well, the conductor would give it to me coming out of St. Thomas, would give it to me first. So when I got the customs papers, I just turned it into the customs officer.
So you're just handing it in for the conductor, because the conductor's actually in charge of that, isn't he? Okay, I thought so, but when you said you're handing it in, I thought I'd learned something new about the brakeman. And yes, how about down Detroit River? You guys just went to Amherst. You didn't go across Detroit River, did you? You were.
Yeah. When I first hired on, we went into the CPR yard, and everything was ferried across. I think it was in '56 or '57 we started going through the New York Central Tunnel. It was cheaper for them to pay us to go through the tunnel at time and a half than have us yard crew in Windsor do all the switching or handling on the ferry, and the same on the other side. So rather, it was easier for them just to go through the tunnel. Now, I think that was in 56 or 57 when that happened.
And tell me a bit how the railway affected your family, or how does it affect your life?
Well, I guess you just got used to being called at all hours of the day or all hours of the night. You knew where you stood to go out if you were going out in the middle of the night, so you went to bed early and got some rest before you got called to go to work.
But there were some times when it was
sometimes you got caught short.
I'm sure, and I'm very curious about the caboose life, and who was doing the cooking in the caboose?
Well, usually you did your own cooking, and it was.
So how many men would be living in the caboose?
There'd be 3 men. There'd be 2 brakemen, tail end brakeman, head end brakeman, and the conductor. So usually you were just your 8 hours there. Sometimes you were longer than that. But the callboy would come and knock on the door if it was the middle of the night or in the daytime. In the daytime you might be interacting with the other cabooses, like when we went into CPR, there'd be C&O cabooses or Pere Marquette cabooses that time, and CPR cabooses there. So lots of times when all the crews are up, or some of them are up, some of them are just coming in and going to bed. But we were interacted a lot and going socializing with one caboose to the other.
Just for the trip, like overnight, right?
Yeah.
Like, how long was the longest time you spent living in the caboose?
Well, sometimes I remember, I think the first Christmas, I think we were ordered Christmas Eve double header to Windsor. And they didn't need us in the crew that we took deadhead, they didn't work, they just climbed into their, because it was nighttime, they just climbed into their bed covers and had a rest going up, because they might be going to work as soon as they got there. But we laid there as I said, my first Christmas, we laid in Windsor for 12 or 14 hours before we got called. We didn't get called out until Christmas Eve sometime. We went uptown and had Christmas supper. So we were there 14 or 15 hours. And later on, and I have been in Detroit, I have been laid in Detroit itself for over 50 hours. You never knew. But most of the time you went right up in your 8 hours and you were coming right back out again, you were ordered again.
And I mean, you mentioned him, the call boy. He's an employee of the railway.
Yes, he was.
And they call throughout the yard. I guess they have scheduled.
It was the same thing. You had a call boy in St. Thomas. He'd phone your home. In the early days, it wasn't before my days, but a lot of people didn't have phones. So the call boy got on his bike and knew the address and knocked on the door and said, "You're ordered for such and such a time." But other than that, why, as I said, you had phones. I always had a phone, of course, at that time. And you were always called by phone. You usually got a 2-hour call. Yeah.
Then you worked for the C&O. Tell me how that, tell me the difference between working for the Pere Marquette and the C&O.
No, that was all the same. I think I got a piece of paper there on. It was 1947. The C&O took over the Pere Marquette. But there was no difference. It was just in,
Because they had actually the C&O
Yeah.
had actually been running it for some time. This is
Yeah.
sort of before they'd owned it since late 20s or early 30s, I think, because they started bringing in the C&O big trains here in the 30s. That's where I know that they, you might even remember the old bridge behind, or you probably wouldn't, but there was an old bridge behind Alma College that they had to.
yeah, I don't remember. That was,
You drove over that.
that
You
was,
drove
that was
across
all
that.
filled in when I hired
That
in
was filled in
44.
the
Yeah.
30s. It's all filled with London garbage too. It's a big pile of London's garbage underneath that hill, under that
Yeah.
causeway. So yeah, tell me a bit about running on the LNPS section. I think that's a unique part
Well,
of that line. So tell us a bit how that worked. If you
In
could.
1944, when I hired you, you wrote the LNPS rules too. You wrote the Canadian rules, and the American wrote the American rules. Of course, there was a lot of passenger trains on the LNPS at those times, in those days, during the war. So you had to get a train order to run from Chester Street to Ross Street. And if you're the head-end brakeman, when you come in from Buffalo, you stopped at what we call Ross Street here, it was the ball, or Ross Street just was there. You'd get on the phone and copy a train order from the dispatcher on the LNPS in London to run from Ross Street to Chester Street again. Because they had a lot of sites of
Traffic there, yes.
a lot of traffic on the LNPS. And of course, we had to handle all our switches. Now it was always left lined up for the LNPS railway.
Yes, and you were, so was there any traffic difficulties ever with that? Did it ever help hold you up there? And also, like I asked you on the Michigan Central, is there any difficulty getting on their lines?
Yeah.
Was there sometimes?
Yeah, lots of times before you left Talbot Yard, you got permission, you'd call the C&O dispatcher, and he was in contact with BX Tower or the New York Central Tower to get permission to let you come ahead. You might sit in Talbot Yard for a while before you left because New York Central, or you may come over and they let you in the yard, but they may hold you at what they call the ball out at the east end of the yard for a westbound train to come in or an eastbound train to go ahead of you on New York Central. So you never knew when you were going to get right through.
Well, I've interviewed Charles Beckett up at the BX Tower, and he always told me that, yeah, we had to let the New York Central guys through first. And
Oh yeah, definitely that.
you're definitely a second class rail.
Yeah.
When you're running on their line,
Yeah.
I can understand why that is. But so anything, anything else that you can think of that you wanted to say or you wanted to?
Well, I can remember, as I said, hired in '44, and the winter of '44, '45 was pretty heavy for snow. And I've heard, I didn't see it happen, but of course there was no diesel in those times, and there was a small yard engine. I've heard it take 3 or 4 small engines, or yard engines, to switch the caboose track in Buffalo. The snow was so high. And I have been in Buffalo for a day and a half or 2 days before you got out of there with the snow.
Well, tell me a bit about your experience. You were there for the changeover to diesel.
Well, they started dieselizing on the New York or on the Pere Marquette in the early 50s, and that was quite an experience. The diesels. They were a lot cleaner, of course. You didn't have to be wear as good or as old clothes, not old clothes, but your coveralls and your uniform was a lot different than once you dieselized.
And how did it affect the brakeman's job?
It didn't affect it too much, no.
Okay.
Yeah, well, it was a little easier getting on and off. You didn't have to climb up a ladder like you did to get into an old locomotive, where the diesel you just swung on the diesel and climbed up the front steps and in the door, or the back door, of course. Yeah.
And what were the what were the first diesels they were using on the early diesels they were using on the scene?
We had 5700s, but we dieseled yard engines. Small yard engines came first, and then the 5700s. Where we heard later, I don't know if it was true or not, that the Wabash Railroad in St. Thomas had what they called covered wagons. We heard her later they had the 5700s ordered first, and then they decided they'd go with the covered wagons, so the C&O took the covered wagon, or the 5700s, and the Wabash got their covered wagons.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously dieselization changed the shop guys a great deal, but not as much for you guys. Tell me a bit about the size of the trains you were dealing with.
Well, in war days, you had 60 or 70 or 80 cars, and then once you did dieselize, why of course they got bigger trains. I have had as many as 123 cars, almost 2 miles long when we doubled it up. We went out on a Saturday night going east to Buffalo on a Saturday night before Labor Day, and they doubled up on the train, or they made her run a Mount Rose turn, but they doubled up the train. We had, as I said, the tail end was shoved out at Talbot Yard, and when the head end doubled up at Talbot, they were just short of the second milepost. So the train was almost 2 miles long. We didn't get to Buffalo that night. Well, we did by cab, but we got as far as the Erie Yard in Niagara Falls and tied our train up there and come back out the next day and got our train, went back right into Buffalo, got another train and come back to St. Thomas. But
well, I remember those very long trains. I'd get stuck at the crossing often.
yeah.
I remember, well, you probably did the same, you try to count the cars, but sometimes they were so long you'd lose count. But what were some of the locomotives that they were using in the war years?
In the war days, ours were all, I'm sorry, all the true freight engines were mostly 1000s, where the yard engines were 600s and the locals 600s and 900s. There were a smaller engine, like they could, but all the true freight engines were all 1000s.
Well, how many switchers did they have out at Talbot Yards?
How many switchers?
Switching it, yeah.
And when I first hired, they didn't have any switchers at Talbot Yard. They were all. Oh, I'm sorry, that's wrong too, because eastbound, if you were ordered eastbound, when you went to work, you got your own caboose and put your caboose on. But the westbound way, you come in, they weren't switched. They had to be switched at Talbot Yard, so there was a switch engine would come on for that purpose. I forget whether it was an afternoon job. I think it was an afternoon job.
Well, because it's totally disappeared now, but it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard to realize how much activity was out at that place,
Yeah.
and how many people worked there, and just all the, because I was used to you wouldn't see it until you went to the country, because I went to Elmdale School, so saw the roundhouse right across the way, and that's all I really remember from kindergarten is watching the train guys. But all that marshalling and all the organization being done out in the country, because it really wasn't on that big a piece of land, the main shops at Wilson and Elm. Is there anything else you'd like to tell me about You're
Well,
talking, how long did you work on, I found out when you began, how long did you work?
I started in 44, as I told you before, and I was laid off in 45 again until almost 50. And then I retired at the end of 88. I was 63 when I retired. I got a full pension at 63.
So you saw the end of the tracks though as well. I mean,
Yeah.
were you here for that last couple of
Yeah.
years? Okay.
Yeah.
Because there was no break. You guys were running on the Michigan Central line.
Yeah, at the last we were running, I
So
had,
the tracks came up in '86.
I had the last train over to New York Central. I'm sorry, over to old C&O railway tracks. I had the last westbound. And then I went into Detroit. When I come back out to Detroit, coming east, well, I come over to New York Central. Into St. Thomas, and that was the last one. In the steam engine days, no, our steam engines had, not all of them, but had scoops. You didn't stop for water.
Yes, the troughs. Yes.
They had track pans on New York Central. Of course, all their high-class freight and their passenger trains, that's why they put them in for them, so they didn't have to stop for water. Not all of our engines had scoops, but most of them had scoops.
And this is the one near Tilbury? Is that what there was?
Yeah, I didn't remember the ones on the west end. I know on the east end, Tillsonburg, Waterford, and Edwards and Perry.
And did they work well for you guys?
Oh yeah, they're very good, yeah.
Never had any problems?
No.
Okay. Well, I think those are fascinating, but I always think that they're going to catch something and, and keeping them liquid in the wintertime.
Yeah. Yeah, they had an operator there who had...
Actually, can we stop there for a second? Could we just start from water troughs again? Explain what they are, because the people who are watching this are not going to know. I'd like to...
Well, the scoop was in the middle of the tender underneath. And there was just like, they had an operating lever up in the cab, or the fireman. They had a light on each end of your water pan. For at night or in the fog, you can tell. The engineer, once he got to the first light, he'd give a toot-toot. And the fireman knew he was on the truck pan, and he'd pull the lever, and the scoop would go down, and of course it would scoop water up into the thing. And then when he got the other end, he'd give another toot-toot, and the fireman got the scoop up before he got the end of the track pan. But they worked very well. Of course, if you were following a train and you wanted to scoop, or you knew he'd scoop ahead of you, you'd slow down a little bit, so it made sure the operator got some more water back into the track pans.
Yeah, I never really thought about that. How were the track pans filled? I mean,
They had an operator there.
Well, where's he getting the water? Is it hooked up to some?
Usually you're by a stream or a river like that, but of course the water wasn't like it is nowadays. You got it from New York Central. They got all their water for if they had to fill an engine here, they got that from Pinafore Park.
Yes, so that's what I'm wondering about the track pan.
Yeah.
Does he have a pump?
Yeah, they had a pump, and they had
get a bucket.
They had a pump there. They had what would I call it? They had in the wintertime they had to heat the water so it didn't freeze. So they had a small stationary to heat water there.
Well, I've heard there's little like kerosene cylinders or something that they. I've heard about something. There's some like they had to light these little torches to keep the thing from freezing.
Oh,
this is how they had some sort of, almost like a sterno can or something like that they put underneath it to melt it, because that's what first I questioned, why didn't it turn into a skating rink immediately, even then, how do they get the water in is a question. Because how much water do you think you were picking up?
Oh, you were picking up I would say 700 or 800 gallons of water, easy. I forget just what. Well, I know our 57 out of here held. I think of 10,000 gallons. So
these pans would just sort of top things up. They weren't really a replacement for watering. You'd have to water these things occasionally, but this would just make it so you didn't have to stop as often.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, there's all sorts of little bits of the technical bits of the, like, did you, as brakeman, did you have separate orders at all that you received? Did you ever, and how would you receive your train orders?
On the Pere Marquette, well, you'd get train orders out of St. Thomas, going west, and you might have, well, in the war days, you might meet 2 or 3 trains between here and Windsor. So, but if every station, the tail end brakeman or the head end would watch for the order board. If you had a yellow order board, you know you were going to scoop some orders. So you had a hoop like this with a string in between here, and you put your arm out and scoop the orders. It might be on the south side of the train or the north side of the train, but you knew what one to look for. You knew your station orders.
And how often would those hoops be on how many were there between here and Windsor, for instance? The places that you could pick up orders?
Well, you may get a restricting order. If you got a restricting order, you got a red board. You might leave in St. Thomas, have a meet on at Ridgetown. And that eastbound he's got preference over the westbound by direction. So they might change that to Rodney. So you come to Dutton, you might get a restricting order, you'd get a red board, you'd have to stop and make sure that you knew you read that order to the operator, that you were being restricted. You weren't going to Ridgetown, you were only going as far as Rodney to meet that train. So you might do that a couple of times going up the line.
And is that, I didn't know that rule. Did you always have eastbound as right of way over west?
Yeah, by direction. Eastbound had direction over the westbound. Northbound had, or southbound had direction over northbound.
Okay.
That was superiority by train.
Is that just on your line, or is that universal?
No, that was the standard rules.
I did not know that one.
Yeah.
Thank you for,
Yeah.
it's so complicated to run a railway. There's always new things for me to find out,
Yeah.
or all the intricacies of running it. Anything else? Is there anything else you'd like to say? I mean, I found out several things after I thought I'd almost done, but anything else you want to say? Or,
Well, to learn your road, it was quite difficult when you first hired on the road, especially if you hadn't, well, you're on the tail end, and at nighttime, you had to know when you were coming to a station, learn when you were coming to Iona, or you might be meeting a train there. You might be train there meeting you not by train order, but by superiority. Eastbound, as I said, was superior to the westbound, and how to explain this, that you run on by time card. So you learned your road. You might go across crossing or culvert, and you knew, well, there's a curve up here ahead. I have to look out to my train on the north side of the train tracks or the south side of the tracks, or in the fog in the wintertime, why you learn your road by different things, going over a crossing or a switch, or might be a switch for a small sub-track, a little substation along the way.
Is there any, what sort of, when you did check those trains, were there any difficulties? You know, what sort of damage, or did you ever see smoke coming out of it, or a broken
Well,
axle?
lots of times, as I said, like especially on New York Central, where you had east and westbound tracks, where if you're on the tail end, you kept an eye, look out behind it. If you see a signal lit up, you know you had a westbound train coming, because he had that signal lit up. Then you'd go out on your platform at the back end of the caboose and watch his train going by and make sure there was no sparks or anything, dragons throwing stones up or anything like that. Then you'd give him a clear signal on the tail end, and he'd give you the clear signal too.
I see, so you were inspecting each other's trains?
Yeah.
And both of the brakemen would get out of the platform at the back
Yeah.
and signal each other?
You'd look at each end of the train, or of course you did the same thing if you were on the head end and you passed on. You watched his train going by, and then when the tail end went by, you stick your head out with the window and give him a highball, or everything was okay. And if everything was out, well, you'd of course give him a stop signal. And then he'd have to find out himself what his trouble was. In the later days, while you had radio communication, you could tell him. But in the New York days, well, you might maybe give him a quick signal. Something like that was a hot box. That was a hot box signal.
And so, and I'm assuming when you were learning these roads, the conductors would help you out
Yeah.
on this.
Yeah.
You know, what were some of the experienced guys on the train like when you were first starting out? What were they like to work with?
Well, I remember the first job I had, Johnny Stevens, and he was a conductor. I first got job on the through freight. I had that regular job, and Johnny Stevens, and he got fired for drinking, but he got back to work after being serving his time. And I always remember Johnny Stevens said, "I drank enough to float a battleship. When I retire, I'm going to refloat her." He was quite a character. There was a lot of characters. I can remember an engineer we called him Whispering Charlie. A lot of them got nicknames like that during the times.
Well, I'm sure there was. I've seen lots of the old pictures, and it was quite a team. You know, working on the railway. I've known some of the shop guys, anyways, and I'm sure you know them as well, like John Parsons and
Yeah.
Ken Verrill, and both guys I've filmed at other occasions. But and then you got to see it's kind of the end of in '86, you know, the late '80s, that sort of disappeared for a bit. And well, you got to I asked you before the switch to C&O. I've heard from other fellows that there was the big switch was from C&O to Chessie and then CSX.
Yeah.
There were lots of changes there, and you know, we've gone from 5-man crews down to pretty much 1-man crews.
Yeah. Well, that's when I retired. I got a payout. I made 2 trips to Detroit. I was working on the West End. Made 2 trips to Detroit without a tail end brakeman. They didn't have a tail end brakeman available on the spare board. So I made 1 trip to Detroit and back without a tail end brakeman. And the next trip I went to Detroit without a tail end brakeman. But when I went to work in Detroit, it called at 2:30 in the morning. Why, this second brakeman was there. They'd send him up by taxi. At that time, we had over 81 cars, so that required the second brakeman. That's long past now.
Well, you saw the disappearance of the caboose. Did you?
Pardon?
Through the disappearance. What year did the caboose disappear?
Oh,
You would have seen that.
well, they were still caboose. They still had a caboose when I was
When you finished?
Yeah,
Okay, but they were starting to.
yeah, they were,
decisions
that's
were-
why I say I got a payoff. They did away with the top 15 men, so that they did away with your tail end brakeman, and shortly after that they did away with the caboose altogether. But when I was still working, we still had a caboose, and I still had a tail end brakeman except for a couple of trips.
I'm just remembering back in my hockey days, I remember my hockey, I think it was the assistant coach of my hockey team, had a baseball cap that said "Save the caboose." You know, and I think it was the days when they
Oh,
made
yeah.
that decision. You know, which seemed like the mid late '80s, something like that. But
Yeah.
we had a summer student in at the museum a couple of years ago, and we came in when we were filming John Parsons then, and we did it out there because it was warmer out there then, and she's from Peterborough, she's about 20 years old, and she looked and she said, "What's that funny car with the box on top?" And I had to explain what a caboose was to her because she'd never seen such a thing. And
That's all right.
so that's why I'm happy
Yeah.
to explain that
Yeah.
we used to actually live in these little huts, but yeah, I mean, you know, what were the conditions? You know, it must have been fairly primitive conditions. And the engineers got dorms, but you guys got the caboose.
Yeah. Yeah, we lived in the caboose where the engineers, when they got the other end of the road, they went to either a boarding house or in the Windsor Yard, the Windsor, they had a dormitory there for the CPR crews in New York Central, or the Pere Marquette crews, where we stayed in the caboose. And the cabooses changed. When I first started, well, they were all coal. When you went to work, you went to the coal bin and filled up coal bin, and you filled your lanterns up with coal oil and lit your lanterns. If it was nighttime, or you fill the fonts up so when it did get dark, you'd go out and then tail end, take your tail lights in and light them up when it was getting dark, and light your own lanterns, light the conductor's lamp on his desk. And then later on, why they were all electrified, of course. They run off
Off the generator.
the generator, right?
And any improvement in the conditions and the equipment in there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you had a coal oil stove then, of course. Yeah. Did away with the old coal oil.
Well, I've seen some of them. I mean, they didn't seem to ever build a new caboose. Some of those cabooses were extremely old.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, they seem to, you know, the first ones that showed up with the Canada Southern, they seemed to repaint them on this line at least. So I've heard that there was, like, you talked about snow coming under the door. I've heard about gaps between the slats on the side, so that the wind would just whistle through some of those things pretty badly. Anything else you can think of asking Hugh?
The only thing would be, what kinds of problems might they be looking for as they're going down the tracks?
What was that again?
What kind of problem, when you were inspecting each other, when you're, you know, what sort of problems were you looking for, and what problems did you sometimes?
Usually, when you walked out on the tail end, you looked between your rails and your ties and see if anything was scuffed up. It was hard to see at 60, 55 miles an hour, but you lose on your curve, or you're looking your other train, or you're mostly seeing that there wasn't any, like what we call a hot box, and then you see a flame or where the hot box where it was, or smoke.
And what's causing the hot box?
The hot boxes nowadays are all roller bearings. In those days, there were what you call a journal pack. And during some yard situations, they hit a little too hard. why they journal was jumping your dope. What you call dope is what you put the oil in, and it lubricated your jacksle every time it turned around. Well, if you got or that dope got underneath your journal, why it would start sucking up all the oil, and it would eventually start a fire in the journal, and then you were looking for a fire along there, or sparks flying with something dragging. I can remember going out east in the steam engine days, and we went in at Hagersville for 2 passenger trains. I think it was number 8 as they leave St. Thomas here at, I'm not sure, 8:30, 7, 9 o'clock at night. We were in at Hagersville for the eastbound. It was in December, I know. We pulled in at Hagersville, and of course I was the head end brakeman. I went to the phone, and he said, "Come back to the phone after 2 passenger trains pass." So after 2 passenger trains passed, so I went back to the phone and got permission to leave. In the meantime, it had been snowing. It was a wet snow, and we were stuck. We couldn't move the train. We were just blowing snow. Of course, the main line was a lot higher than the passing track, and of course it drifted over, and just a wet snow, so we had to walk back and take half the train and shove it back down the main line. We got permission to do that, and then go in and get the other half and move it out, and then double back over double our train and go east. But in the meantime, while we were doing that, conductor, when we started pulling out, he swung us down. He had a brake beam down. So it was wet snow, as I said before, and I had to walk back to the engine, get a hammer and a chisel, and walk back and take the cotter keys out and take this brake beam and throw it into the ditch. That's what you did in the old days, you just threw it off in the ditch. But that was one experience where I was wet almost up to my knees, even though I had high boots on, from walking back in this wet snow. But it didn't take long to get dried off, and in the steam engine days, you just stood in front of the firebox and you were dry in no time. I think one of the biggest trains I ever had, I said, was close to 2 miles long. I think I had the heaviest train that ever went through St. Thomas. I had 130 cars, or I like them out of Detroit with it. 130 cars of corn. It was 16,500 and something ton. And usually a coal train, I've checked on my books, and a coal train, 89 cars, was just over 10,000 ton. And I had a couple of circus trains, Barnum and Bailey circus trains out of Detroit to St. Thomas. And I had one west, was a Monte Carlo circus train. And I had a Barnum and Bailey circus train when I was working on the East End from St. Thomas to Niagara Falls, New York. But that was some of the different trains you had, as I said, in the war days, where you had oil trains or coal trains, even trains with military equipment on, flat cars, so forth.
Yeah, Ken Dodd, we've interviewed him. He talked about engineering a couple of the circus trains and
Yeah.
The complications of watering all of the animals, or how long it took.
Yeah.
All right, we got what we need. Hugh?
Yes, I think so.
All right.